Hello, everyone. Everyone doing great today? Good. It's good to be here. It's a bit far. I flew from Ghana. There wasn't a direct flight to Palm Springs, but I made it okay. So today I want to talk to you about aspirational Africa. And this talk is going to be a bit different. So you can't sleep because I'm going to give a short presentation and I want us to engage in some questions and really get a sense of how people are thinking about Africa and we can have some interesting discussion here. How many people here have actually been to Africa? Wow, that's incredible. Okay, so I want to talk about aspirational Africa opportunities for the 21st century. My company, Golden Palm Investments, I started it in 2007 when I was an undergraduate at Harvard College. And the idea and the thesis was Africa is basically today we're at an interesting standpoint where we are where China and India was 15 to 20 years ago. And I realized that we're at an inflection point of political stability, economic growth, and a massive emergence of a stable consuming and middle class. So we decided to build businesses on the continent, focus on the African consumer. But first, let me take you back in history. I'll never forget this day, May 11th, 2000. This was the cover of The Economist. I was in a car with my father going to school, and there was a lot of traffic. So often the street hawkers would say, Economist, 50,000 CDs. My father would buy one, give it to me, and I had about an hour to finish it before we get to school, and then I had to return it to him to take to the office. And I remember that day because I turned to him and I said, Dad, why are we hopeless? Why do they think we are hopeless? In a stunning reversal 11 years later, the same magazine, either there was some long-term memory loss going on, or something was happening in their office because the same magazine that rendered my entire continent hopeless suddenly has on its cover Africa Rising. What changed in 11 years? Did Africa suddenly transform from being hopeless to suddenly being this beacon of hope? Or is the fact that 6 of the 10 fastest growing economies in the world being in Africa compelled the editors at The Economist to grapple with this reality of Africa rising? Perhaps few epitomize this evolution and this understanding of Africa from a hopeless continent to Africa rising than Mo Ibrahim. When Mo founded Celtel in the mid-90s, it was such a contrarian bet on Africa that some countries gave him the license for free. Many people said he was destined to fail. How could those poor Africans use mobile phones? And how could you make money from that? Yet when Mo sold Celtel in 2006 for close to $4 billion, what was more impressive than the amount of money was the fact that he had built a business with 24 million subscribers in 14 African countries. Not a bad job for poor Africans who can't use a mobile phone. Incredible success. And today everyone knows the story of the mobile revolution in Africa with 1 billion mobile subscribers and growing every day. This takes us to Africa today, aspiring Africa, as our good friends from The Economist call it. What is this aspiring Africa today? Well, Africa, as most of you know, having traveled there, is a huge continent with 54 different countries. I've been to 43 of them. In 2 weeks, I'm going to Somalia, which will be my 44th. And this vast, rich, diverse continent represents 1.1 billion people. 1.1 billion people. It's sometimes so easy to think of Africa as this little small region somewhere. 1.1 billion people with a $1.6 trillion economy. Consumers on the continent spent close to $1 trillion last year. And GDP per capita on average is about 1,500. Yet what's more exciting is the future. By most estimates, in 2050, Africa's population will more than double to 2.4 billion. I want you to marinate on that for a second and think about what that means. That means over the next 35 years, 1 billion babies will be born in Africa. 3x the population of the US will be born in Africa in 35 years. That is mind-boggling. The economy will expand to over $8 trillion, and African consumers will spend over $3 trillion. And GDP per capita is going to reach the very interesting threshold of $5,000 per capita. We're in for fascinating times. So as an entrepreneur and an early stage investor, what do I do with this? How do I take advantage of this trajectory? How do I think about Africa? I'm going to give a case study from one of our portfolio companies that I imagine would interest you. It's in media and entertainment. Solo Phone. Solo is based in Nigeria. And to understand the story of Solo, I'm going to tell it through the eyes of the African consumer. Consider Ibrahim in Kano, Nigeria. He's the one frowning. Ibrahim is frowning because he doesn't like his feature phone. Like you and I, he's on Facebook, he's on Twitter. He wants a cool phone. He wants an iPhone. He wants a Samsung. He wants a smartphone. He doesn't want this old little thing that he can't even tweet on. But he can't afford $1,200 to buy some of these expensive phones. So what does Ibrahim do? Well, therein comes Solo. Solo designs smartphones for the African consumer. We have a number of different models ranging from $60 to $150. And for someone like Ibrahim, look at this phone. Doesn't it look so beautiful? It's very nice and fun. Ibrahim won't frown anymore. He can walk around with the phone and feel, aspirational Africa. He can feel very aspirational with this phone for $100. Android-based. But Ibrahim doesn't just want a phone. When he goes home, both he and his grandmother want to listen to music. Africans love music. Anyone who's been there, Africans, we love music. But the problem? When they were in Cupertino and in Seoul and they were making, and in Sweden, when they were making, iTunes and Spotify, no one thought of Africa. So no one thought to say, 80 to 90% of them don't have credit cards. How are they going to sign up for Spotify or iTunes? And they wonder why we pirate. We couldn't even pay if we wanted to. And so we said that's a problem, but they want music. So we created a solution. We partnered with a lot of the music guys in the US, and we have Solo Music, 20 million songs. You can listen to the new Rihanna, and you can listen to Two-Face in Nigeria, free on the mobile phone. And they love it. Nigerians love this and are downloading it. But then we realized that they don't just want music. Anyone who's been to Africa knows we love movies. We love African movies. In fact, Nollywood, Nigeria's Hollywood, is this. I'm not joking. It's actually called Nollywood. I'll tell them you laughed. It is the second largest by volume in the world. Yes, by volume. It's second to Bollywood and ahead of Hollywood. It's incredible. Massive multi-billion-dollar industry. And it's doing incredibly well. People love African movies. So we said to ourselves, let's give it to them. We created on the phone this app where people can stream both Hollywood and Nollywood offerings on their mobile phones. But we run into a little problem. With 1 billion mobile subscribers, anyone who's tried to watch YouTube or download anything in Africa knows it takes a long time. Does anyone remember dial-up? That's how I feel when I'm trying to download stuff in Lagos or Accra or Lusaka. It just goes, takes forever. And so we had to go back to the drawing board. And we said, we can't be like others who design a phone for a Westerner. We have to think, what can we do for the African consumer? And we thought, well, if they can't get to the internet because of tough infrastructure, we'll bring the internet to them. And so we designed Solo hotspot kiosks and put them in high traffic areas where you just connect to our hotspot and you download your movie in 2 to 3 minutes. Isn't that wonderful? African innovation at its finest. Because to do well and to succeed with the African consumer, you cannot take what has worked in Cali and just cut, copy, paste. You necessarily have to apply your strategy to the idiosyncrasies of the African consumer. And for me, when I think of the work we do on the continent, I think of this guy, Madiba. Why? Because with 1 billion babies that will be born in the next 35 years, the 20th century on my continent was mostly one of Madiba and Nkrumah and Kenyatta and the freedom fighters. The 20th century was one of political liberation on the continent. The 21st century is going to be one of economic freedom, because the political freedoms for which they fought for is meaningless without economic freedom. The 21st century, I dare say, will be the century of the African consumer. Thank you. Now some questions. Okay.
I think I might have either missed part of the story or I want to know a little bit more. You said one of the big challenges is there's no real payment infrastructure existing across most of the countries in Africa. And you put together the music service and you put together the movie services. Are you giving it to them for free?
No.
So how are you charging them?
No, great question. So I said there was no payment system from a Western perspective of credit cards. Because if you sign up for Spotify, it asks for American Express, Visa, MasterCard, Discover. Most people don't have access to that. However, we went and said, how do people pay? So more people don't have credit cards, but we have 1 billion consumers with mobile phones. And so we integrated mobile pay into our solutions, where if you don't have your Visa or your Amex, you can just pay using your mobile credit. And in fact, during lunch, I had the pleasure of having Mr. Murdoch next to me, and I told him, I subscribe to the Wall Street Journal on my phone. My friends do, but many other people would want to. Why don't you connect it to MTN Mobile Pay or some of the other mobile pay, so everyone else who wants access to it can just use their mobile credit to pay for it? And I think thinking about it from that standpoint of who is the African consumer and how does he go about doing things, enables you to customize your solutions in a way that would make sense and that would allow you to capture a growing and increasingly important market. Very good question, thank you. Right. So again, it goes back to, the question was, what are the other markets we're investing in outside entertainment and mobile? So our thesis is centered around the African consumer. Who is the African consumer and what does the African consumer need? So one of the big markets for us, for example, is healthcare. Why? We have 11% of global population today, yet we have 26% of global disease burden and only 3% of healthcare workers. In fact, we're responsible for 67% of all HIV/AIDS cases, 50% of infant mortality, and 50% of malaria cases globally. It makes no sense. There's a huge supply-demand imbalance. And so there's a real opportunity here to craft healthcare solutions using both brick and mortar, put in retail. We're investing in building retail clinics, but we're also leveraging technology. So by digitizing the whole ecosystem, it means now we're saving time. We're using analytics to understand what are the most important diseases, what are the greatest incidences. We're using data to understand how can we manage inventory on the pharma side of things, and how can we proactively figure out how to better manage healthcare from a meta and a macro perspective. So we're really using technology as a way to get involved in other sectors. We're doing the same thing. Africans need to, 1 billion babies coming on. In fact, one of our portfolio businesses I love is we invested in a baby food business in Kenya. It's a lot of babies we have to feed, 1 billion, right? And so we're making baby food using local ingredients because people can't afford Cerelac. right? It's 600 shillings in Nairobi. And we're using local ingredients to make highly nutritious, high quality baby food and selling it at 150 shillings. The question is, who builds out the broadband infrastructure? Is it public or private? I think it depends. So, if you go to a place like Rwanda, President Kagame is highly committed to broadband infrastructure, and he's been investing heavily in it. In fact, in many villages in Rwanda, the internet is a lot better than in many other parts, in many other cities you go to across the continent. In Kenya, it's been a mix. You've had some private investments. You've also had the government invest heavily. In Nigeria, the private sector has largely been leading that. In Ghana, the private sector has largely been leading that. Though you have, so Vodafone bought the what was previously owned by the government, Ghana Telecom, and that used to have a public broadband infrastructure, but that's now in private hands. So it's a mix. I think it depends from country to country. But generally speaking, you are seeing a lot of public-private partnerships because both the private sector and governments recognize the need and the opportunity in increasing broadband access. One last question over there. So I think, look, I think a lot of opportunities are being missed. First and foremost, you have to understand that America still has a huge brand premium on the continent. People associate quality with the US. People love America across the continent, largely speaking. And I was telling Mr. Medoc, if I go across the board, you see CNN is showing Africa startups. I think there's a huge opportunity for Fox to go in and create African content. And I think you need to fundamentally rethink how you look at Africa and think of it from a standpoint of it is a large market with 1 billion people, but it's also a market with 300 million middle class that spent $1 trillion last year. And so if you can think of mass market approaches and different go-to-market strategies, there's a real way to monetize it. If you can also think of mobile, where you might not have every household that has a television, but you now have 1 billion subscribers with mobile phones, and smartphone penetration is increasing. So if you think of mobile as a platform for distribution, you suddenly come up with interesting ways in which you can not just create content relevant for the continent, but also distribute that content in a way that adapts to the local idiosyncrasies. So I think there's a real opportunity here. And it's an opportunity that's going to continue to grow, and one that you certainly should capitalize on sooner than later. Well,
there's a significant stereotype that we are inundated with, and that is corruption and lack of transparency and instability. How big of a problem, or how do you address that or work around that country by country? And is that not really true?
You know, it's a real, I would be remiss to say, oh, it's not an issue. But, you know, if you go to the state of Illinois and you look at what's happened to the last several governors, you would, you could raise the same issue. So I think corruption is a big issue globally, everywhere. But I think you find ways to work around that. So, for example, if you look at a country like Rwanda, Rwanda is a place where you're actually going to have there's very little tolerance for corruption, right? Even if you take a place like Nigeria, which traditionally has been bogged with this stereotype of being corrupt, a lot of that is changing among the private sector. The election of Buhari has brought a lot of transparency and transformation among the government there. I think what's important with a lot of these markets is having the right type of local partners. So making sure you have the right types of local partners who will be able to work with you in navigating the local politics and navigating the local markets and understanding who the good guys are, who the bad guys are, and how to do it effectively. But this is the same issue that's been mentioned about China, about India, about lots of other places, Brazil and what have you. And still, you know, there have been lots of success stories that have come out of these regions. So I think, look, it's an issue. It's not to pretend it's not an issue, but I think it's an issue that is not specific to the African context. It's a global issue, and one that, with the right local partners and the right strategy, it should not be a problem. We welcome all capital. no, no, but there's a lot of Chinese. In fact, the Chinese capitalized on the global financial crisis when a lot of the West pulled back and they went in flush with cash. But I think the narrative is changing in that a lot of people are realizing that there's no such thing as free lunch. And so, the Chinese were writing huge checks, but it comes at a cost. And so there's slowly been a shift now whereas before there was a huge appetite for Chinese capital, I think today there's a greater value proposition for what I call smart capital. And so going in and saying, look, I don't just want to write a check, but I want to help develop local capacity. I want to help create a long-term sustainable relationship that is not just about taking resources and bringing it home. Thank you very much.